I'm Miriam. Sitting here in the aftermath of that Thanksgiving dinner, the silence in the now empty dining room is deafening. The turkey has long since gone cold, the cranberry sauce congealed, and the once lively chatter replaced by an eerie stillness. The events that unfolded here just a few hours ago feel like a fever dream, yet the evidence of what transpired lies spread out on the table before me. 26 pages of bank statements, a fraudulent power of attorney, and a torn crossword page with 3 words circled in red. My mind drifts back to the moment we walked in. The shock on my brother Darren's face as he opened the door, the way the room fell silent as if time itself had stopped. My mother, Evelyn, stood at the head of the table, a carving knife in one hand and a serving fork in the other, her eyes wide with disbelief. My father, Henry, sat to her left, a half-empty glass of wine frozen halfway to his lips. And at the far end of the table, in her blue church dress, sat my grandmother, Rose, her hands folded in her lap, a small smile on her face as she looked at me. It all started years ago, when I left our small town of Riverdale after high school. I was determined to make something of myself, to escape the narrow-mindedness and judgment that seemed to suffocate me. I moved to the city, got a degree in social work, and eventually landed a job as a senior investigator for the Adult Protective Services. I was good at my job, having resolved 47 cases of elder financial exploitation and recovering over $3 million in stolen assets for victims. But my family knew none of this. To them, I was just the daughter who left and never came back to do anything useful. My grandmother and I had a special bond, forged through our shared love of crossword puzzles. Every Sunday morning, we would sit on the porch of her farmhouse, the same porch my great-grandfather built, and work through the puzzle from the Riverdale Gazette. She would let me hold the pencil and fill in the easy ones, while she handled the rest and explained the answers to me. It was more than just a pastime, it was a language only the two of us spoke. My mother, Evelyn, had a different story. She got pregnant with my brother Darren at 18 and had to drop out of college. She spent the next 35 years raising us, running the household, and working part-time at the local church. I think she resented me for having the opportunity to leave and pursue my dreams, while she was stuck in a life she never wanted. My father, Henry, was a hard-working man who drove a truck for most of his life. But 6 years ago, he had an accident that left him with a bad back and unable to work. He turned to gambling to cope with his financial problems, and in the process, he lost whatever savings he had. 2 years ago, I received a call from my grandmother asking me to come to the church potluck. I drove the 45 minutes from the city, bringing a casserole made from her recipe. When I walked into the fellowship hall, I was immediately met with my mother's disdain. "Well, look who showed up. Miriam just sits in the city doing Lord knows what," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The other women laughed nervously, and my brother chimed in, "At least she found time to come eat. That's the most productive thing she's done this year." I felt my face flush with embarrassment, but I held my tongue. I knew it was not worth arguing with them. As the months went by, I noticed a change in my grandmother's phone calls. They became shorter and more guarded, and she would often say that my mother was there and she couldn't talk long. One day, she told me that they had changed her pills, and she wasn't sure which ones she was taking anymore. That was a red flag for me. In my line of work, I knew that when a caregiver rearranges an elderly person's medication without explanation, it usually means they're either neglecting the schedule or using it as leverage. I started to do some digging. I found out that my grandmother's property tax bill was delinquent for the first time in 50 years, and her bank statements showed a series of suspicious withdrawals. I also learned that my mother had taken control of my grandmother's finances and was not letting her see her own statements. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that I couldn't just barge in and accuse them. I needed evidence. That's when I met Mrs. Thompson, my grandmother's neighbor. She had been friends with my grandmother for years and noticed that something was wrong. She told me that my mother was not letting my grandmother out of the house, and that the garden that my grandmother had always taken such pride in was now overgrown and neglected. She also gave me a key to a secondary savings account that my grandmother had opened years ago, just in case something like this ever happened. I went to the bank and got a 6-month statement on the account. What I found made my blood boil. There had been 3 withdrawals in the past 2 months, $500 each, all made at the ATM on Main Street, the same street my mother passed on her way to the grocery store. I knew then that my mother had figured out the PIN and was stealing from my grandmother. I took the evidence to my supervisor, Mr. Johnson. He was a seasoned investigator who had seen it all. He understood the conflict of interest, but he also knew that I was the best person to handle the case. He agreed to let me provide the initial intelligence and step back from the investigation, and he assigned Janet, one of our best investigators, to take the lead. Janet worked quickly. She filed for financial records through the county court and got a subpoena. When the main account records arrived, we were shocked. Over the past 2 years, approximately $127,000 had been withdrawn from my grandmother's account. There were monthly transfers of $2,000 to my father, labeled as household expenses, and charges to a medical billing company that didn't exist. My grandmother's arthritis medication had been unpaid for 3 months, and her power of attorney had been signed during a hospitalization for pneumonia without her full understanding. We knew we had enough evidence to file charges, but we needed my grandmother's confirmation. That's when the crossword puzzle came in. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Mrs. Thompson found my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table with a page torn from the Sunday crossword. 3 words were circled in red ink: help, trapped, call. And at the bottom of the page, in a shaky hand, was another word: Thanksgiving. Mrs. Thompson took a picture of the page and sent it to me. I knew then that my grandmother was asking for our help, and she wanted us there on Thanksgiving. I immediately called Janet and Mr. Johnson, and we started to plan our intervention. The next few weeks were a blur. I spent my days at work, preparing for the case, and my nights poring over the bank statements and evidence. I also kept in touch with Mrs. Thompson, who gave me updates on my grandmother's condition. She told me that my grandmother was eating and sitting up, and that she had put on her blue church dress, the one she saved for special occasions. She knew we were coming. 10 days before Thanksgiving, I received a group text from my brother. He had created a family thread, inviting everyone except me to Thanksgiving dinner at my grandmother's house. The message read, "Hey everyone, Thanksgiving at Grandma Rose's this year, Thursday, 11 a.m. I'm doing the turkey. Bring sides. Let's give Grandma a real family Thanksgiving she deserves." I read the message and smiled. I didn't need an invitation. I had something better. I spent the next few days preparing copies of the bank statements, the power of attorney document, Janet's formal investigation summary, and Mrs. Thompson's sworn affidavit. I organized everything in a manila folder labeled with nothing but a case number. On the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, I packed a small bag and drove to Riverdale. I checked into the motel on Main Street, the same street where my mother made her ATM withdrawals. I laid the folder on the desk, set my alarm for 6, and went to sleep. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early and stared at the ceiling. The city outside was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get on holidays. I showered, dressed, and put on my gray blazer, the same blazer I wore to court appearances and victim interviews. It was a work outfit, a symbol of the authority and justice I was about to bring. I drove to the diner on Main Street and had breakfast. I read the Riverdale Gazette, the crossword section out of habit, and thought about the 22 people who would be sitting around my grandmother's table in a few hours, eating turkey carved by my brother in a house where the gutters were falling off because the repair money went to gambling. At 10:15, Janet pulled into the diner parking lot in her state-issued sedan. Deputy Miller arrived 5 minutes later in his cruiser. We sat in a corner booth and went over the plan one last time. Janet would present the APS investigation notice, Deputy Miller would provide security and serve the temporary protective order if needed, and I would be there as family. At 12:15, we got in our cars and drove to my grandmother's house. As we drove through Riverdale, I saw the familiar sights: the elementary school where my grandmother taught for 40 years, the church where my mother volunteered, and the hardware store where my brother worked. The road to the farmhouse ran through 2 miles of farmland, rolling hills, and white fences. It was a beautiful sight, but I knew that beneath the surface, there was a darkness that needed to be exposed. When we arrived at the house, there were 6 vehicles parked in the driveway. My brother's pickup, my mother's sedan, my father's new truck, and 3 others I didn't recognize. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, and the smell of roasted turkey and sage dressing hung in the cold November air. I parked on the road just past the mailbox and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked up the porch steps. I looked at the wicker chair where my grandmother and I used to sit and do crosswords, and I felt a pang of sadness. I straightened my blazer, picked up the manila folder from the passenger seat, and walked up to the door. Janet flanked my left, and Deputy Miller flanked my right. I raised my hand and knocked. Not the polite knock I had done before, but a firm, professional knock. The door swung open, and my brother stood there, a dish towel over his shoulder and a smile on his face. The smile disappeared as soon as he saw me. His eyes moved from my face to Janet's APS badge and then to Deputy Miller's uniform. The dish towel slipped off his shoulder and landed on the floor. What is this?" he stammered. "Hi, Darren. We need to come in," I said. He didn't move. He just stood there, like a deer in the headlights. Deputy Miller stepped forward and said, "Sir, we're here on official business. May we come inside?" Darren stepped back, and we walked into the house. The dining room was filled with people: my mother, my father, my aunts, uncles, cousins, and their families. They all looked up at us, their eyes wide with surprise. My mother was the first to speak. "Miriam, what are you doing here? Who are these people?" Janet stepped forward and opened her portfolio. "My name is Janet, Adult Protective Services. We have an active investigation into the financial exploitation of Rose. Over the past 2 years, approximately $127,000 has been withdrawn from her bank accounts. The withdrawals are traced to Henry and Evelyn." The room fell silent. Everyone stared at us, their mouths agape. My mother's face turned red, and she said, "This is Thanksgiving. You can't come in here and ruin our dinner." Deputy Miller said, "Ma'am, please have a seat." Janet laid the bank statements on the table, all 26 pages. She placed them carefully, fanning them out between the turkey platter and the dinner rolls. "These are Rose's bank statements from the First National Bank, obtained through a court-authorized subpoena. They document systematic withdrawals totaling $127,000, monthly transfers of $2,000 to Henry, labeled as household expenses, and charges to a medical billing company that doesn't exist." My father's hand was shaking as he set his wine glass down. "Rose gave us that money. She wanted to help," he said. Janet interrupted him. "Mr. Foster, Rose's arthritis medication has been unpaid for 3 months. Her pharmacy discontinued the prescription. Her property taxes are 6 months delinquent. The power of attorney was signed during a hospitalization for pneumonia, and it has never been reviewed or renewed." My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked like a man who had just been caught in a lie. My mother was still standing at the head of the table, her hands gripping the back of her chair so tightly that her knuckles were white. She turned to me and said, "You did this. You called the cops on your own parents." I looked at her across the table, at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was worthless. I spoke in a calm, even voice. "I didn't call the cops, Mom. I am the investigation." The room shifted. I could feel the collective intake of breath from everyone at the table. They had always thought of me as the black sheep of the family, the one who didn't fit in. But now, they were seeing me in a different light. I said, "My name is Miriam, and I'm a senior investigator for the Adult Protective Services. I've held this position for 6 years, and in that time, my unit has investigated and resolved 47 cases of elder financial exploitation, recovering over $3 million in stolen assets for victims. You always said I sat in the city doing Lord knows what. Well, now you know what I do." My mother exploded. "You ungrateful child. After everything we've done for you, you come here and accuse us. How dare you?" I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there and let her rant. I knew that she was lashing out because she was scared, because she knew that she had been caught. Finally, she ran out of words. She stood there, breathing hard, her face red and tear-streaked. I said, "It's her house, Mom. And her money. And her choice." My father made one last attempt to defend himself. "This is a family matter. Rose asked us to manage her finances. It's all a misunderstanding." Janet said, "Mr. Foster, the evidence speaks for itself. We have enough to file charges for financial exploitation and theft over $10,000, which is a Class C felony." My father's face fell. He knew that he had no way out. And then, my grandmother stood up. Mrs. Thompson, who had been sitting beside her, took her elbow and helped her rise. My grandmother looked around the room, her eyes filled with sadness. "I taught second grade for 40 years. I saved every penny I could. I raised my children in this house, and they took everything except my crossword puzzles. That was their mistake." Everyone at the table was silent. They could see the pain in my grandmother's eyes, the betrayal she felt. My brother, who had been standing in the doorway, walked over to me. His eyes were red, and he said, "You were trying to tell me." "I'm sorry." I put my arm around him. "It's okay, Darren. I know you didn't know." Deputy Miller stepped forward and said, "At this time, Henry is being asked to accompany me for questioning regarding potential felony elder financial exploitation. Evelyn is being served with a temporary order restricting contact with Rose and access to her financial accounts pending the completion of the APS investigation." My mother started to cry. She looked at my grandmother and said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." My grandmother looked at her and said, "I kept your graduation photo on the wall for 35 years. I was so proud of you. But you let me down." My mother's face crumpled. She knew that she had lost her mother's trust. And as she was led out of the room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. Not for her, but for the family that we could have been. 3 months after Thanksgiving, my father accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation and ordered to pay full restitution of $48,000 over 5 years. He was also given a permanent no-contact order with my grandmother. My mother's case went to trial, and she was found guilty on 2 counts of financial exploitation and 1 count of theft over $10,000. Her sentencing is pending, and the restraining order remains in effect. My grandmother's power of attorney was formally revoked, and her accounts were frozen, audited, and restored to her sole control. The balance won't reach $131,000 again, but the bleeding has stopped. Her property taxes were paid, and I covered the cost. She insisted on paying me back at $12 a month because that's who she is. Her arthritis medication was reinstated, and a home health nurse visits 3 times a week. My brother and I have grown closer since then. He has apologized for not believing me, and he has been helping my grandmother around the house. He even replaced the gutters on the farmhouse himself. And every Sunday morning, I drive the 45 minutes from the city to Riverdale to sit on the porch with my grandmother and do the crossword puzzle. It's a small thing, but it means the world to me. A crossword puzzle. 3 words circled in red. That's all it took to unravel 10 years of lies. If someone you love is being silenced by a spouse, a child, or a caretaker, remember, the quiet ones are often the ones fighting the hardest battles you'll never see. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment if you've ever been underestimated, and subscribe because on this channel, silence always finds its voice.